Red flags you should never ignore, backed by research. Some of the most dangerous people in your life will never raise their voice. They will smile, they will reassure you, and they will tell you exactly what you want to hear while quietly teaching your nervous system to distrust itself. And the disturbing part is this: research shows that most people do not ignore red flags because they are naive, they ignore them because the mind is designed to protect attachment before it protects truth. So the question is not, can you recognize danger? The real question is, what part of you keeps translating warning signs into hope? Because not every wound enters your life like a storm, some arrive like shelter. And maybe that is the deepest tragedy of human nature. Not that we fail to see danger, but that loneliness can make illusion feel safer than truth. So before we talk about the red flags themselves, we first need to understand why the human mind was built to ignore them in the first place. Why humans ignore red flags. The human brain is not a truth machine, it is a survival machine. And survival often depends on belonging. Psychologists have studied something called cognitive dissonance, the mental tension that appears when reality contradicts what we want to believe. When someone shows us signs of manipulation, signs of dishonesty, signs of emotional volatility, or signs of lack of empathy, our first instinct is often not rejection. It is reinterpretation. We minimize, we rationalize, and we create softer meanings for harder truths. Because accepting reality sometimes means accepting loneliness, accepting disappointment, or accepting grief. And the mind fears emotional exile more than dysfunction. This is why people stay too long in toxic friendships, why warning signs in relationships are reframed as potential, and why charisma is mistaken for character. The ancient wisdom traditions understood this long before neuroscience did. They warned that deception rarely appears ugly in the beginning. It appears desirable, appears comforting, and appears even luminous. A poisoned river rarely announces itself at the source. Once you understand this, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. Most people are not deceived by words alone. They are deceived by hope repeated long enough to silence observation. Which brings us to the first red flag people almost always explain away. Red flag 1. People reveal themselves statistically before they reveal themselves verbally. The first red flag you should never ignore is this: a repeated mismatch between someone's words and their behavioral patterns. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that patterns predict future behavior more accurately than promises do. People reveal themselves statistically before they reveal themselves verbally. Anyone can perform sincerity temporarily, but sustained behavior exposes internal structure. So, pay attention to repetition. Not isolated moments, not emotional apologies, and not intense conversations at 2 a.m., but pay attention to patterns. If someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, repeatedly disappears when accountability appears, repeatedly creates confusion, and then asks for understanding, the pattern is the message. Many people wait for certainty before trusting their intuition. But certainty usually arrives late. Truth whispers before it announces itself. And deep down, the body often notices before the conscious mind does. This is why researchers studying emotional stress found that prolonged exposure to unpredictability increases anxiety dramatically. The nervous system does not relax around inconsistency, it prepares for survival. A healthy connection may contain conflict, but it does not require constant emotional decoding. And over time, inconsistency does something dangerous to the human mind. It slowly trains you to question your own perception instead of questioning the pattern itself. That is where the next red flag begins. Red flag 2. People often betray themselves long before others betray them. The second red flag is more subtle and more psychologically destructive. You begin losing trust in your own perception around them. Not because you are irrational, but because reality is constantly being reframed. One day your concerns are too sensitive, the next day they never said what you clearly remember hearing, and over time, confusion replaces clarity. This dynamic resembles what psychologists describe as gaslighting. A form of manipulation where a person systematically destabilizes another person's confidence in their own memory, emotions, or interpretation of events. And the danger is not only emotional, it is existential. Because once a person loses trust in their inner compass, they become dependent on external interpretation. This is how people slowly abandon themselves. Not all at once, but in tiny negotiations. A silence swallowed, an intuition dismissed, or a boundary postponed. Until eventually, peace feels unfamiliar. There is an ancient spiritual pattern repeated across generations. People often betray themselves long before others betray them. Not out of weakness, but out of fear that honoring truth may cost connection. Yet, every meaningful life demands this confrontation eventually. Will you preserve attachment, or preserve integrity? Because you cannot continuously sacrifice reality without damaging the soul. Because once a person loses trust in their own inner compass, manipulation no longer needs force. Performance becomes enough. And some of the most convincing performances arrive disguised as charm. Red flag 3. Charm is not character. Another red flag research repeatedly warns about is high charm combined with low accountability. Some people are incredibly skilled at emotional performance. They know how to appear self-aware, how to sound emotionally intelligent, and how to mirror values they do not actually live by. Studies on manipulative personality traits show that charisma can sometimes function as social camouflage, especially when paired with confidence. And this creates a dangerous illusion. People assume likability equals trustworthiness, but charm is not character. Character reveals itself most clearly when accountability enters the room. Watch what happens when someone is corrected, when boundaries appear, and when they do not get what they want. Do they reflect or retaliate? Do they seek understanding or immediately reposition themselves as the victim? Mature people can tolerate discomfort without collapsing into defensiveness. But fragile egos experience accountability as annihilation. And when someone cannot face their own flaws, they often begin managing perceptions instead of pursuing truth. This creates relationships built on image rather than sincerity. Beautiful on the surface, but exhausting underneath. Like a house with painted walls and rotting foundations. The problem is that charm can distract you from what your nervous system already understands. Because long before the conscious mind admits something is wrong, the body has usually started keeping score. Red flag 4. Your energy shrinks around them. There is another warning sign people rarely discuss because it sounds less scientific, but modern psychology increasingly validates it. Your nervous system changes around them. You become hypervigilant, become careful, and become edited. You rehearse conversations before speaking, you monitor tone excessively, and you feel relief when they leave. The body keeps records the mind tries to erase. Researchers studying chronic relational stress found that emotionally unsafe environments create measurable physiological effects: elevated cortisol, sleep disruption, mental fatigue, and emotional numbing. Sometimes your exhaustion is not from life, it is from proximity. Healthy relationships do not require you to abandon yourself to maintain stability. You should not have to shrink your personality to avoid emotional consequences. And yet many people normalize this because dysfunction, repeated long enough, begins to feel familiar. Humans adapt even to unhealthy environments. A person raised around chaos may interpret peace as boring. A person raised around emotional inconsistency may interpret anxiety as love. But survival patterns are not always truth. Sometimes healing begins the moment you stop calling suffering normal. And perhaps that is why ignored red flags become so dangerous. Not because they appear dramatic in the beginning, but because they slowly reshape what feels normal. Which leads to the deeper psychological truth underneath all of this. The deeper psychological truth. Here is the uncomfortable reality beneath all of this. Red flags are not difficult to recognize, they are difficult to accept. Because acceptance changes things. It forces decisions, forces boundaries, forces endings, and forces transformation. And transformation often feels like death before it feels like freedom. This is why many people stay inside cycles that quietly diminish them. The familiar pain becomes safer than unfamiliar possibility. But every ignored red flag extracts something over time. It saps energy, erodes identity, shatters trust, and steals years. There is an old spiritual principle echoed across civilizations: whatever is repeatedly tolerated eventually shapes the architecture of the soul. Not because punishment arrives from the outside, but because repetition becomes identity. What you excuse consistently, you slowly become unable to see clearly. And clarity is sacred. Not perfection, not control, but clarity. It is to see reality without distortion, without fantasy, and without fear of rewriting the evidence. Because truth may wound temporarily, but illusion wounds continuously. So before pointing outward, pause for a moment and look inward. Ask yourself, do I often explain away behavior that repeatedly hurts me? Have I confused emotional intensity with emotional safety? Do I feel more anxious than peaceful around certain people? Have I abandoned boundaries to avoid losing connection? Do I trust patterns or only apologies? Am I listening to my intuition or negotiating with it? What truths have I already recognized but delayed accepting? If I met this dynamic for the first time today, would I still allow it into my life? Sometimes the clearest sign is not what another person is doing. It is what your spirit has been trying to tell you in silence. Not every red flag means someone is evil. Human beings are complicated, wounded, and unfinished. But understanding someone's pain does not require abandoning your own discernment. Compassion without wisdom becomes self-erasure, and wisdom without compassion becomes coldness. The goal is neither paranoia nor cynicism, it is clarity. To recognize that peace is not found by avoiding truth but by aligning yourself with it. In an age where performance is rewarded more than sincerity, discernment becomes a form of protection. And maturity is not learning how to judge people perfectly, it is learning when your soul has already seen enough. What is one red flag you ignored that later changed how you see people or yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading them may finally recognize what they've been trying not to see.